Hello and welcome to The Course. I'm your host today, Lee, and I'm speaking with Associate Professor Greg Norman from the Department of Psychology. Professor Norman has a secondary appointment in psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience, and his research focuses on stress and how it affects the body. Professor Norman is here to talk to us about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome, Professor Greg Norman. Thank you so much for joining us on the course today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Greg, can you give me a general overview of your career path, beginning in college all the way to where you are now?
It's certainly not a traditional one. For most of, I would say, my undergrad time, I thought I was going to be an Olympian. I was part of Ohio State's track and field team. I had now looking back on a very strange belief that I was going to make a living running in a straight line as fast as I can. A lot of my undergrad was spent really dedicating my entire life to that. Fortunately, now looking back, I had an injury right around my senior year that really allowed me to kind of reevaluate everything. And one of the things that was crystal clear to me is now that goal wasn't going to happen, I needed to figure out something else that was really going to, challenge me and let me have the, kind of fun sort of career I always thought I was going to have. So, it's one of those things where I just asked a lot of people what things individuals do, what major should I take? Psychology seemed interesting to me initially because, one of the things you see with athletes is all the different ways individuals deal with pressure, with stress, how they respond to competition. So nothing too much deeper than that. That was enough to kind of get my interest. And then basically, I just started going down a list of the psychology faculty at Ohio State and tried to meet with them. And fortunately, I came across a number of helpful individuals that took me under their wing. Gary Bernstein, Courtney DeVries, Charles Emery at Ohio State. These really played a really positive impact on my career, really got me focused on what it means to be an academic, how to study, how to do well in classes. And then I was fortunate enough to get into graduate school at Ohio State and work with Courtney DeVries and Gary Bernstein, primarily looking at stress, trying to better understand the molecular, physiological, all the way up to the kind of psychological mechanisms that allow us to respond to stress so differently. I was in grad school. I did grad school in about three and a half years, then came to University of Chicago as a postdoc to work with John Cassiopo to get a kind of better handle on how the things I was learning about the kind of mechanism of stress in animal models, how they might apply to human research. So had a pretty intensive training and as a postdoc, kind of learning how that applies. Did a lot of work in some intervention studies that he had ongoing with the military, where we tried to look at soldiers and try to come up with plans to see if we can intervene on the kind of the negative mental health consequences of going to war, which is about as traumatic as it gets. So that was very helpful for me to learn, on the job practice and how that all goes. And then fortunately, I was able to convince enough people, at least at U Chicago, to keep me around as faculty. And I started as faculty in 2012.
Wow, that's so interesting that you had that initial dream when you were in college.
Yeah. Interesting one way to describe it.
I mean, is that something that you had always wanted to do? Like when you were a kid, were you like, I'm going to be an Olympian when I grow up?
Yeah, it was always, I was going to be a professional athlete. I mean, that's always it. When I was a kid, that's what whether it was football, baseball, track, whatever it was, that was my obsession all the way up until starting back as far back as I can remember, all the way up until my injury. That was it. I was maybe not the most strategic individual. I didn't really have a plan B. I put all my eggs in the one basket, as we're told not to. And then, was kind of left with the difficulty of figuring out what to do after that kind of basket went away. It's interesting to look back now. At the time, it was, I thought it was the biggest crisis anyone's ever went through. But, it's one of those things where at the time it did seem that way. But looking back, I'm very thankful it occurred, because if it wouldn't have happened, there's no way I'd have been strong enough to realize that at the time. I would have probably still, for the next 15 years, kept trying to be a professional athlete.
So are there any memories from that time that you can look back on and say, oh, wow, it does kind of make sense that I became a psychology professor?
I think it's one of those things where we can all look back and maybe put a nice story on all it kind of makes sense how I got here. But I can say, when I interact with, my friends from college this is still the case when I see them from time to time, they're like, there's no way we saw any of it. At the time, I didn't know any better, but everyone around me certainly surprised that occurred, in line with what my research interests are now. A lot of them come from watching how extremely talented individuals, everyone kind of agrees that these are the best of the best when it comes to, at least when I was at Ohio State, right? The, top-notch recruits, and then watching how all of these individuals dealt with the pressure associated with, losing associated with being beaten at practice or losing big races. How do we all deal with that and differently? And it was very, at the time, pretty surprising to me, all the different coping mechanisms that people use, whether, effective or not effective. So yeah, I think now, given what my research is, a lot of what I focus on is trying to better understand how we kind of perceive those stressors and how, the way we kind of think about stress has such a large impact on how we deal with it. And that's right in the wheelhouse of what I study now. So yeah, they're certainly related, but I wouldn't, it's one of those things to where I wouldn't like when I'm not trying to tell a story that it was nice and clean and linear. It was stumbly a lot of the way to get to where I'm at now. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, that interested me back then. And I think that little seed kind of grew to inspire a lot of my current interests now.
Yeah. And tell me about your research interests now.
In our lab, we're primarily interested in understanding stress. So I'm trained as a psychophysiologist. And so basically what we're interested in studying is how to, the mind and the brain interact with the body in order to respond to stressors. So, that means we bring people in the lab, we hook them up to electrodes or get some spit, maybe some blood, try to look at all the kind of physiological indicators of stress. We do a lot of stressing individuals out within the lab, ask questionnaires, have kind of behavioral tasks to get at the underlying psychological mechanism to try to both measure all those, that kind of variety, and then try to do a better job of explaining why do we see so much variance? Why is it, one participant has one type of coping strategy to the same stressor as the next participant to, try to better understand what's going on mentally to allow that to happen. So yeah, a lot of it just kind of basically boils down to trying to understand the mental, neural, and physiological mechanisms that give rise to all the fun and exciting ways humans respond to stress.
So you mentioned that your path to academia was bumpy. Can you tell me about some of the resistance or the challenges that you encountered on your journey through graduate school? And
I mean, so resistance, I think, was appropriate, especially when, right after my injury, after some, pretty dark times of soul searching, of just realizing at the very least what I was I just needed another thing to challenge myself, whether or not it was going to result, maybe I would fail. But, after all of those years of getting pretty used to that level of intensity, it was pretty clear that whatever I'm going to do next, I needed to really challenge myself. And, kind of going around and asking individuals, kind of that sort of process. It was, I would go talk to faculty members or, maybe advisors, and I would tell them what my grade point average was. I was already a senior in undergrad, and, correctly, they would tell me the chances of you getting in are extremely low. So I think right out of the gates, the first thing I had to deal with is just trying to figure out how am I going to overcome that relatively low GPA, the fact that I didn't have the sort of coursework a standard graduate school applicant does. So it's one of those to where that inspired me a little bit. It was not overly surprising. But then, after that, after spending 2 years of, really, taking twice the normal course load in most of my classes at this point, or I had to be in graduate school so I could try to convince some advisor at some point that I could hang, not like many individuals do. The first round of applications I probably put in, it had to be 50 grad school applications, and I got a grand total of no acceptances. So, that's another type of resistance, maybe not as crystal clear, but, it's clear to me at least. It's one of those to where that was really tough. And it's one of those to where I thought of it as a challenge, and with the support of loved ones and friends, was able to push through. And then the next time I applied, I was able to get into at least a couple. But then even then, it's one of those to when you get into grad school, it's not like the resistance stops. So something that I've always been interested in is kind of the intersection between social processes as well as physiological processes. And there's a lot of resistance to that's not, at least historically, that wasn't the most traditional path that you could go to study. And so there was, appropriate levels of resistance, but, it's one of those to where it made me better, right? It made me have, at least at some level, have better arguments for why I want to do something along those lines. And then, really, I allowed me to be really sure that these are the topics that I'm particularly interested in. But yeah, I think it's one of those to where it's hard to imagine any of these stages happening without resistance. I mean, I think the expectation has to be people are going to question you, are going to say, how could you do it? Or, what are the attributes that you have that could make that happen? I don't think that's necessarily a sign that they're doubting you per se. Maybe they were, but I think it points out things that we can challenge ourselves on. So yeah, and I would say the resistance still, we all still experience it. So it's not like it's necessarily one way.
Who did you rely on for support during this journey, both, when you're trying to finish the coursework that will help you get into graduate school, and then once you are in graduate school, and the rejection that you just described? I can't imagine that was easy. So who were the people that you turned to for support?
First and foremost, my wife. She's my best friend. I got married pretty young, so she was around to see all of that. Way at the top of the list, her support throughout all these years, and continued to being the case, is has been necessary. But focusing on grad school, one of my, both my advisors, Courtney DeVries and Gary Bernstein, were both absolutely essential. And Gary Bernstein, who's, helped create some of the fields that I work in, and some level is one of the top-notch figures in the fields of things like psychophysiology and social neuroscience. I was just unbelievably fortunate. Our paths crossed at a time to where he was thinking about retirement. So he had a little bit more time than I think he would have in the past, and a little bit more patience to allow me to come in and talk to him about my failures. And what do I do with that? What should I expect? What does that mean? So he spent an awful lot of time just watching me wriggle and deal with that, and providing the sort of advice you need, which is welcome to the club. Rejection's part of the game. And at some level you get better from it. As long as you're not being rejected for the exact same reasons over and over, it's something to be expected. So, I'm really simplifying that because there's a whole bunch of those meetings and a whole bunch of tears and frustration on my part. But yeah, just having a faculty member there who knows a lot more about this, just telling me things will be okay, or telling me, these are things you need to focus on, and allowing me to kind of express where I'm concerned and giving advice was essential. There's no way I'd be able to do it without that sort of support.
So psychology is a broad field. There are a lot of career paths that you can take with this degree and this interest. Why become a professor?
Yeah, I would like to take a step back and really, have some really well-reasoned plan for that. I think what it boiled down to at some level was, as I mentioned before, especially right after I was done with my athletic career, I was really looking for a challenge. And one of the first things that, talking with these individuals like Professor Bernstein and Professor DeVries, they were professors. And so that, at some level kind of locked into where that is something right in front of me and something I would like to do. And then so that's kind of why initially I decided that might be a goal of mine. But then, to be honest, through grad school, through my postdoc, it became even clearer to me that one upside that I didn't think of in the past is the ability to help students like they helped me, right? So it's fun to be a professor and be able to talk about things that I would nerd out about, whether I was being paid. Maybe I would like to continue being paid, right? But it's one of those I'm, intrinsically interested in. It's unreal that we get to do this for a living, where we're, get to really focus and study the things we're interested in. So that, along the process of grad school, it became a little bit more crystallized. That's what I want to do. But yeah, initially it was just, that was the thing to slot into what we want to have as a goal to challenge myself. And it just, basically I learned, kind of over the years, the kind of justify perhaps to myself why I actually want to do it.
And how did you realize your particular interest in psychology, like your focus in the field? How did you realize that that was something that you wanted to study? I know that you talked a lot about your experience in sports and how stress impacted the body. I wonder, how did that crystallize or develop for you throughout your career path?
Sure. I mean, the standard sort of a little bit more boring stories, both of my advisors in grad school were also studying stress and motivation. So it's one of those to where, you get up to your eyeballs trying to learn from your mentor. So it was, made it a little bit easier to crystallize. That's where a lot of my interest started. And then at some level, kind of catching up on readings and catching up on kind of the theories and the methods in labs that were also studying it really made it clear that that's what I want to study. And then same thing with my postdoc advisor. And most of the reason I wanted to work with that individual's stress, right? So it's one of those to where there wasn't really a lot of hesitation, because none of the other topics that I could have studied were, right in front of my face available. And also none of them really grabbed my interest. So from early on, it's been something I've been interested in over time. It's one of those things to where you become a little bit obsessed with the topic. You really particularly interested with it. And fortunately for me, that happened pretty early on. It was a little bit less of a kind of active decision-making process and more of, how can I figure out a way to have a career where what I get to do is study this particular topic. I also benefit from the fact that stress is, as we all know from experiencing ourselves, a pretty broad topic. So at some level, being interested in stress allows you to be interested in just about anything psychologists or neuroscientists or physiologists could be interested in, just under that sort of construct. So there's plenty of wiggle room, under that big umbrella to really be interested in a lot of other things.
It's so interesting to me that you're studying stress, or that's your interest in research, because I know that you were experiencing a lot of stress along this career path.
Yeah. So, it's one of those to where, there were some huge downsides to not kind of having the academic background that a lot of people I was kind of competing with. But one very big upside that I had is being comfortable with stress, right? I mean, it's certainly Division I sports. I mean, you're just in a constant state of pressure, stress, failure, overcoming it. I mean, that's just every day at practice, that's just part of what you have to do to, at some level, move forward on that. I think that gave me a lot of the coping strategies that were required to deal with that pretty intense level of stress when, like, early days when I was being rejected and It was hard enough to even get anyone's attention. But yeah, during that sort of process, it's one of those where I've certainly always been aware of that sort of stress. And I'm aware of, certainly seeing my students go through it. But I think, again, the huge benefit that I had is not being afraid of it at some level. I would like to avoid it if we could, but sports really teaches you how to deal with it and almost to expect it when it's something that you care about. So yeah, along the way, you get that weird situation where while you're learning and becoming an expert on stress, then you start almost meta stressing. You have stress about having stress, which is a whole neat phenomena. But yeah, certainly along the way, I was aware of learning all the bad things that stress can do to you while being stressed is a unique experience.
Yeah, I imagine. So on a more positive note, where do you draw inspiration from? Are there people that inspire you? Are there things in your field that are happening right now that are inspiring to you?
Yeah, that's a really tough. So yeah, I can't help but probably give a really painfully corny answer to where, especially it's still one of those where I still haven't. I still sometimes don't necessarily feel like an academic. I feel at home at UChicago and being in our department, but it's one of those without that. For the first, say, 23 years of my life, I didn't even really know what that means. So I'm still at the stage to where I find my colleagues, and seeing them work through the problems they work through or see my students work through. It's all, inspiring to me. Thank goodness that makes my job a little bit easier to where the inspiration's that close. So for me, it's, that's fun. I can nerd out about that, ask questions, learn about how did individual X deal with this? What sort of procedure they take. That to me is still fun and interesting to learn about. So that is something that still really inspires me to this day. Super corny, I know, but the truth.
So what are your personal goals for yourself as you move forward in your career?
Yeah. So, that's a tricky one because, certainly when you kick this off, you have very specific goals like getting into grad school and then maybe getting a postdoc and then getting a faculty position. Once you get a faculty position, you're able to get tenure. So fortunately, a couple of years ago, I was able to get tenure, which really gets you in that, it's not like it's over by any means, but it opens up the door a little bit for thinking, about some bigger picture goals. So, it's one of those to where, I would like to become full professor. I have those, career objectives that we have there, but it's one of those too, where just trying to think of how to make myself a better mentor, how to make, instead of focusing just on these very immediate goals that we all have to, jump through those hoops. But now that there's a tiny bit of breathing room, not too much. I don't want the dean or the chair to think I'm slacking by any means, but I think it gives us a little bit more wiggle room to think about how could we inspire students to make their lives better and make them better researchers, or more organizational things about how can as a department, or, I have no control on this, but certainly something to think about moving forward. How can we do things maybe in a more efficient or kind of effective way? So, just starting to think about those sorts of things is fun as a goal, instead of really worrying about this very next kind of career milestone that if you don't reach, you'll be fired or something along those lines. So that's still certainly a learning process.
Greg, what would you say is the most fun part of your job?
The most fun is just getting to actually nerd out about stuff. It's one of those to where there are parts of it that certainly aren't fun, but, getting to sit here and think about all of these topics revolving around stress, how we deal with it, how we think of it, is something like I, mentioned earlier. It's just intrinsically interesting to me, and I would do it even if I weren't being paid. So that in and of itself is intrinsically just fun. I think, in a related sort of question, what's the most rewarding? I think that's a no-brainer to me. Even though it's the hardest part by far is the mentoring part. It's one of those to where I have plenty of failures as a mentor, but being able to see those little pockets of you actually having a positive impact on people's lives and then helping them through, these are difficult, especially during COVID, right? But, outside of COVID, these are tricky, scary, difficult times, and being able to help students through that and allow them to excel or thrive as much as possible is, even if it's, not always successful. I don't by any means want to toot my own horn or being too good of a mentor, but just seeing those little pockets of opportunities where you're able to help is definitely the most rewarding.
So, Greg, I know that you had a really interesting path. It's not the standard path, and you had this dream completely unrelated to academics that you wanted to pursue. So, you are coming at this from a very interesting vantage point where you discovered an interest in academia later on in your college career and had to work, it sounds like, extra hard to make that dream a reality. So what would your advice be to people considering entering this field? And I'm especially wondering what you would say to someone like yourself who is, discovering an interest in a subject, interested in academia, but maybe they don't have the best grades. Maybe they don't have all the required coursework completed.
Yeah, that'd be a tricky one to have that conversation with myself. But yeah, if anyone's in that, if someone were to be in that situation, what I'd probably do is just try to lay out right in front of them that it's okay if that's what that's great. I wouldn't want to be the person to tell them it's not possible. But I think in a lot of ways, the most constructive conversations that I had when I was in that situation was with people being honest with me, of just going, look, on paper, it's going to be borderline impossible for you to get in, and working with me to come up with ideas to where if you're willing to deal with that adversity and you're willing to accept that sort of challenge, knowing what you're getting into, here are some particular strategies that you could take. So I would say, just because it's more than daunting, right? It's very terrifying, especially when everyone's telling you it probably won't work. Worst thing is they're right. You try really hard for a little bit of time and it doesn't work out. Wouldn't be the end of the world. But it's one of those to where, be prepared to work really hard. And the most important thing with all of those is find some people you trust, some people, kind of in the know, and work with them on your plans and strategies. And also use them when you need help, like when you fail and, you feel like you're about to give up. That's when, those individuals can be most helpful. But yeah, it's one of those to where, any of these sorts of positions like this are going to be extremely difficult to actually attain. But I think a lot of the times the biggest problem we run into is we talk ourselves out of it before we start. And so when we're thinking of these sorts of, it is a process that takes a lot of time and effort. If someone's really invested in doing it, I think working on a plan, talking with people they trust, and then starting on that plan, knowing along the way, as long as people aren't lying, they're going to tell you how hard it is, right? Because it is hard. And that shouldn't necessarily discourage you if going into it, it is extremely difficult. But, in that case, if you put everything on the table, you try as hard as you can, and you get 3/4 of the way, and then you decide it's not for you, the other way to think, that's not failure either. I bet, at some level you learn a lot in that sort of process, and, you build character and become probably a stronger individual. So I think, calibrating what counts as success and failure, and working on plans and strategies with, as many people in the know that you can. And also, knowing that you're going to have a whole bunch of difficult conversations along the way. And that's just, certainly part of it.
Greg, I know you touched on this a little bit before, but I want you to elaborate on this point about what to you is the most fulfilling part of the work that you do.
The most fulfilling part is, having students in my lab who I have at least I can remember how scary that beginning is. And, if you come into graduate school, fundamentally, the reason you're going there is you really don't know what's going on, right? You don't know how to get a PhD. You don't know what it takes to get a PhD. So they're coming in many cases, they're some of the most talented students around that we could find. And then at some level, in many cases, they're dealing with, for the very first time, failure. What feels like failure to them, like that first couple paper rejection, or at some level, not knowing how to design a study. So taking those very talented, highly motivated individuals and kind of helping them through that process and teaching them, some of the sort of skill sets that are required to do this, and then watching them thrive, watching them deal with adversity, being there for them as much as you can, and watching them push through it. Even if it's a slog, right? Even if it's a grind, just watching students be able to, at some level, accomplish things that in the recent past they thought were impossible, and doing that with them is just, it's a joy. Helping other people, there's plenty of research on this topic, is one of the most rewarding things you can do. And particularly when you're helping people that you care about, if they're your students, hopefully you have a positive relationship with them and you care about them, helping them through difficult situations that we're all familiar with, and then watching them kind of learn from it and get better as both a scientist and building character. And then certainly watching them go on and maybe be professors at other places and train their own students. It's hard for me to envision professionally things more rewarding than that.
Thank you, Professor Greg Norman, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. Leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for listening.